All right, everybody, welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble, and I am Flint Dibble, and I am here with the amazing Dr. Paul M. Cooper, a longtime
Hello.
friend of the channel, I guess. And Paul, by the way, is the author of several fantastic books, most recently The Fall of Civilizations, which just came out in paperback, as well as two fiction books, The River of Ink and All Our Broken Idols. And probably most of you know him for his phenomenal Fall of Civilizations podcast and YouTube channel. That has gotten over 100 million views and downloads, which is just stupendous.
My name's Paul Cooper, and you're listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast. Each episode, I look at a civilization of the past that rose to glory and then collapsed into the ashes of history. I want to ask, what did they have in common? What led to their fall? And what did it feel like to be a person alive at the time who witnessed the end of their world?
So yeah, Paul, I'm really glad to have you here.
Oh, really great to be on. Yeah, we have to go way back, don't we, Flint? Because you very kindly offered to help me with some insider archaeological advice on my second novel, All Our Broken Idols. And you gave me so much data and information about how archaeology is actually practiced. You corrected some real misapprehensions I had when I was writing that novel, and honestly really made the whole thing shine by the end. So I'm indebted to you.
I don't think I did that much, but it was a pleasure to read the draft that I read and give a few comments on archaeology and stuff like that. Because yeah, I mean, your writing is fantastic, as is your podcasting. And I have to say, you were one of the. I know we're just kissing each other's asses here. Sorry, everybody, but you were one of my influences for starting doing public engagement. Really, back in 2018, I was living in Athens, and I was trying to do a little bit of public engagement on Twitter, and I'd be posting into the void. And then I came across this Twitter thread of yours about the Temple of Olympian Zeus and the stylite, this sort of little hut that's up on top of these columns here, and the kind of monk or whatever that was doing penance living on there, and how they redid the ruin. And it was your viral threads that got me thinking, you know what? I could maybe try to do that as well. And so that's what really started my public engagement game, sort of tweeting sometimes on similar things like the Heinrich Schliemann who tore down this tower here that used to be on top of the Acropolis, and different archaeology topics, which of course got me to where I am now. That's how I ended up on Joe Rogan debating Graham Hancock, was due to my Twitter threads. So yeah.
No, you do marvelous work, and you've gathered a well-deserved following.
Yeah, no, but you are my origin story, or at least part of it. You're not the only one deserving credit, but yeah, you're definitely a big part of it. So I want to talk to you today about the Fall of Civilizations, your book and your podcast, and some of these topics. It's a phenomenal book. I recommend it to everybody. In fact, I think I recommended it on Joe Rogan in the conclusion. I showed that and Eric Klein's 1177, and I think we should talk a bit about the history of this, but also what it could mean for today. So that's where I want to go with this. And this sort of comes out of your love of ruins and your research on ruins, right? That's how your introduction starts.
Yeah, that's right. I've always been fascinated by what a ruin means. My story really starts in 2016 when, as part of the research for my PhD, I visited Iraq, and I was taken to explore one of the ruins of Saddam Hussein's palaces. It's this enormous austere building that sits on an artificial hill outside the city of Hilla, which is about 100 kilometers south of Baghdad, overlooking a bend in the Euphrates River. And it's amazing. You can go into this palace now, and the whole place, you can still see the remnants of the finery that was once there. There's a rumor that Saddam Hussein, after building the palace, only ever visited it once, but that his cook would every night cook him a meal just in case he ever turned up by surprise. And nowadays you can walk through the grand hall of this palace and see the walls spattered with graffiti. There are local children, kicking a football about this cavernous space, and little glass beads from what was once a grand chandelier in the center. And when you step out into the balcony of the main bedroom, you realize why Saddam built his palace on this spot, because it overlooks this stretch of ruined, crumbling walls where 2,500 years ago the city of Babylon once stood. And this was a thriving ancient city, at one point the largest city in the world, most likely. And Saddam built his palace here in order to encourage comparisons between himself and the kings of ancient Mesopotamia. He was attempting, kind of like Mussolini with the ruins of Rome, to reinforce his authoritarian rule with these kind of grandiose ideas about the great kings of the past.
That was exactly the comparison I was thinking of, was Mussolini in Rome and the
Yeah.
Arapakis. Yeah, exactly.
Right, using the fasces, which gives us the word fascism, most notably. But Saddam even went so far as to reconstruct some of the walls of Babylon. And once he heard that kings like Nebuchadnezzar used to stamp their names on these clay bricks that they used, he wanted to do the same. And so now you can wander around the site and see some of the modern reconstructions have bricks that are stamped with inscriptions in Arabic, like from Nebuchadnezzar to Saddam Hussein. Some of these are really fanciful reconstructions as well. He has an amphitheater, which we don't think Babylon ever had. It's a kind of like pastiche, like an archaeological Disneyland. But just stepping into this amazing site where you have the modern ruin of the palace on the hill, the ancient ruin of Babylon down below, you just get this sense of human history as this text that's constantly being rewritten, scrubbed out and started again. A constant kind of reimagining of what a site can become and how two ruins can speak to each other. So for me, this was really what got me interested in this idea.
Yeah, that's a very archaeological approach, because we oftentimes think of archaeology as a palimpsest, so this kind of erasure and rewriting. And I mean, I always try to make this point. I mean, this image with the Acropolis works really well because it's always changing, from a classical temple into a Roman sanctuary, into a Christian sanctuary, into a Muslim sanctuary, into a medieval fortress, and then now today into this ruin that sort of glorifies Greece's classical past. And so you can see this constant reworking that, I think it's really fascinating to think through. So your academic research and your PhD was sort of on modern engagement with ruins and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, a large part of it was looking at how novelists in Iraq and filmmakers, so the novelist Sinan Antoon, who wrote novels like Ijam and The Corpse Washer, and the filmmaker Mohammad Ad-Daraji, who made films like Son of Babylon, how they use both the ancient ruins of Iraq, the modern ruins of authoritarian rule, of colonial rule, how they use the figure of the ruin to evoke the process of history ongoing. But also I had one foot in the history department looking at how the actual ruin of Babylon itself has been used in so many different ways, how it appears in the Bible, how it's used as a kind of metaphor for tyrannical authoritarian rule at times, how the Ishtar Gate of Babylon is actually transported brick by brick to Berlin to be reconstructed there. So now we have a kind of Theseus's ship situation where you have a kind of concrete reconstruction of the gate in situ in Babylon, but a kind of bizarre reconstructed version using the original bricks in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Which is the real Ishtar Gate? We'll never know. So these are the kinds of interesting questions you can tease out of ruins that are constantly being made and remade by the people who encounter them.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it's so important in our contemporary world as we're thinking about things like the Parthenon marbles and all these different questions of who owns the past and what to do with it and how to conceptualize it in our own world. Yeah.
And your example of Schliemann is really interesting, who is notorious at various sites for dynamiting his way through various strata of the archaeological record in order to get to the proper ruins underneath, which were the Roman ruins usually.
Or Bronze Age oftentimes. Yeah, he would go through some of the Roman stuff at Troy and whatnot. Yeah, he was notorious. That's why he wanted to tear down that tower. He saw it as a eyesore on the skyline of Athens in the 19th century. And so he and some other archaeologists and politicians of the early Greek state organized to tear down that tower. And there's still a tower in the corner of the Parthenon that's the way they've conserved it, it's invisible. And so you can still climb up it if you get permission. I went up there as a student, and you can look down into the Parthenon. It's kind of cool.
Amazing. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a question that constantly recurs when you're talking about the study of ruins, which is, can a ruin be ruined? Is there a state in which we need to preserve it, where it needs to be kind of crystallized in time as the proper version of the ruin? Or can it be, in some sense, destroyed or deteriorated or vandalized? A great example is the Colosseum in Rome itself, which, after its use as the the great amphitheater of the Roman capital, has a huge afterlife as a Christian site of worship. It's a pilgrimage site because the idea was that Christians had died there, fed to the lions and so on, and that you were coming there to, pay homage to these people who'd given their lives for their faith. And so there was a Stations of the Cross around the arena for a while. For a long time, it was a wild, overgrown place as well, covered in greenery. And there's some wonderful paintings by people like Francis Town, who painted almost like, they look like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, just vines draping down the sides of these walls in a very romantic way. And today, the floor of the Colosseum has been excavated, and all of that greenery has been stripped away. But there's a sense where we also have to appreciate not just the golden age of a building, but its afterlife as a ruin, and how that has a kind of life of its own.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think these are the complex decisions archaeologists need to make when presenting a site too. You have to make a clear decision about what kind of narrative that you're going to present to make it understandable. Because if you leave everything there, then it's just such a mishmash of stuff that it doesn't make sense to a tourist. And so, it's really complex, and there's a lot of discussions that go on as you excavate about how far down you want to go, partly to preserve certain things for presentation, and discussions on then conservation and how much to reconstruct and whatnot. It's always an ongoing discourse between various different stakeholders in an archaeological site. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think being engaged in that kind of process, as I'm sure gives you this insight into the fact that we're constantly telling stories about the past, even in the way that we present a site. I think there's a common public misconception that history or archaeology is a kind of solid set of facts and dates that are, unchanging and unmoving, that we simply just need to gain the data and then we'll understand history. But actually, these sites are in a constant state of interpretation, and being woven into a narrative that is this kind of unfolding text of history.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. This is why you have such a great podcast. You're very poetic, even when speaking off the cuff.
Well, I like the sound of my own voice, which helps.
I can tell, man. I can tell. So how did this interest in ruins and the dynamic state of ruins in many ways, how did this transform into your interest in the fall of civilizations? Because I get how they're related, but it's also a very different kind of sociological concept in many ways, and a historical concept. So how did this transform? What got you, what triggered you to move in that direction?
Well, I think I was sharing these stories online and just finding that people were, I expected to really just reach a few like-minded individuals, really. But I found that there was this appetite in the people who were sharing the threads, people who were liking, retweeting, commenting, that they wanted to hear these stories about the past, that people were fascinated by ruined sites and what they represent. There's such an ancient fascination, this desire to gaze at ruins. A ruin is a place where your imagination is constantly being stimulated. When you walk around a ruined palace or temple or a medieval castle, you're constantly imagining the way life was back then, what it would look like if the walls were complete, if the floorboards were still there, the lives that people lived in these places. So when you walk through a ruin, you're constantly engaged in this act of imagination and creativity, really. I think people resonated with those stories for that reason. And I began to want to take the story further. I almost use a ruin in each episode as, in the same way that a body on the first page of a detective story is used. You stumble across this murder that's happened, and now you want to know the story. You want to know who the villains were, what the murder weapon was, and see the detective go through the story of uncovering this. So I really always start with usually the first written account of someone coming across one of these ruined places and writing about the peculiar feelings that it evoked, the kinds of melancholy, the sense of the enormous power of time that's passed over this space.
Surprised at the sorry sight of the once great city of Bukhara, Ibn Battuta continued on to the opulent metropolis of Samarkand. But when he arrived at the oasis of Samarkand, he found it too was in a much diminished state. The city was sparsely inhabited, its legendary walls torn down long ago, and its grand buildings standing in ruins.
وكانت على شاطئه قصور عظيمة وعمارة تنبئ عن.
There were formerly great palaces on the riverbank, and constructions which bear witness to the lofty aspirations of the townsfolk. But most of this is obliterated, and most of the city itself has also fallen into ruin. It has no city wall, and no gates, and there is vegetation growing inside it.
To sit for a moment with that feeling of discomfort that the ruin produces, but also romance, and then to ask, well, how did that ruin get there? Because every ruin is also a place of historical rupture. It's a place where the world was one way completely, and then one day it was a completely other way. People left, these roofs fell in, the city burned maybe. Every ruin is a place where one day the future was cancelled. And so then you can go back to the beginning and ask, what happened? And there's always a dramatic story to tell.
What's your favorite story? Which one?
I mean, that's such a difficult question. I think some of the most marvelous stories from history are, for me, the stories of contact, the stories of people like Cortez and Pizarro who arrive in the New World and bring with them all of the ideologies, the kinds of ways of thinking that their world has inculcated in them. And they encounter people like the Aztecs, like the Inca, people like the Emperor Atahualpa or Moctezuma, who themselves are also completely products of their own world and completely different worldviews. They're these stories of a kind of tectonic collision of two cultures that I always find so fascinating.
Huh. Interesting. That's that. And I guess in some cases that leads to ruins, but it also, and that transformation that we see that you're talking about, because it's that collision of different cultures and people with different ideas. And oftentimes it gets very violent and nasty, as it does with Europeans in the Americas. Yeah.
The stories of immense violence, immense dispossession on the part of indigenous peoples, but they're also just stories of an encounter after which nothing was the same, after which everything changed for both peoples, which for me makes them such irresistible stories to tell. Yeah.
But a lot of these falls, let's say, are not always due to this kind of cultural contact. Several of them are due to sort of just internal changes or climate. In fact, we could skip ahead really quickly to my question that I got from one of my patrons. A common factor that comes up in your examinations of fallen civilizations is climate change. And so what kind of lessons do you think we can learn from this? Do you see any examples of those that have survived or have been resilient? We'll move to the last question in a second, but because that's different. But yeah, I mean, what do you see? Do you see this collision of cultures as the driving force behind most of our falls, or do you see environmental change or internal? Having gone worldwide on this and across history, is there any common thread that you can see?
Yeah, I mean, the collapse of a society is never a simple event. It's usually a confluence of multiple factors. You could crudely group virtually all of the stories I tell into three categories. One of which is a society destroyed by colonialism, such as the Inca and Aztec. The other is to be absorbed and conquered by the Roman Empire, and the third is a kind of climatic collapse. This usually involves a local climate shift that brings about a series of droughts, sometimes just climate instability, maybe drought one year, torrential rains the next, but often it's a kind of mega drought, which is a drought that lasts for 10 years plus, sometimes even arid periods that last for a century or more. And this just puts strain on every aspect of a society. It makes it difficult to feed your population. It makes it difficult to maintain your cities if your population begins to crash. And also it usually causes neighbors themselves to become desperate. Maybe peoples that you had a kind of amicable relationship and up until that point suddenly are starving and are moving into your lands where perhaps you have a greater water supply, or you have greater capacity for food production, which means you're also facing determined enemies who are themselves fighting for survival. I think that's a story we see again and again in times like the Maya, the classic Maya collapse in the 9th and 10th centuries, the Sumerians and Akkadians, possibly the Indus Valley civilization. I guess we don't know so much about that. Yeah, I think there is a limit to how much we can apply these stories of climate collapse to our modern predicament, because the kinds of small climate shifts that destroyed a Bronze Age society like the Sumerians are minuscule compared to the drastic and extremely rapid climate change that we're currently experiencing, that we're currently causing. We're going to be facing extreme weather. We're going to be facing perhaps the collapse of multiple bread baskets. It's difficult to say how much we can learn from these stories of, relatively early societies being destroyed by similar threats.
Yeah, it's always tough to apply the past to the present because it doesn't just repeat itself. But as somebody who studies environmental archaeology and thinking about the collapse of the Aegean world at the end of the 12th century, that kind of time, end of the Bronze Age, you can definitely see that at that point it's an extended period of aridity, and you can see them trying to over centuries. It takes them centuries in the Greek world to adapt and sort of change their ways of producing food to adjust to this new kind of climate regime that exists.
Yeah.
Analysis of ancient pollen in the region shows that plants suited to a more desert landscape flourished during this time. Analysis of sediment cores and oxygen isotopes in mineral deposits in caves in Israel have all shown that the 13th and 12th centuries BC saw much less rain than the previous era. And this all points to a period of climate change in the region, during which the crops that people knew how to grow must have died in the earth. Alongside this scientific evidence, we can see marks of severe droughts and famines in the region's written records too. The Hittites in their dry, stony mountains were hit particularly hard. Letters from Ugarit write about sending large quantities of rain up to the hill roads to feed the mighty cities like Hattusha, and the crisis seems to have lasted a long time. In the mid-13th century, one Hittite queen sent a short but dramatic message to the Egyptian pharaoh.
I have no grain in my lands.
It's relevant, but and it shows that we need to adapt and mitigate this really quickly, but obviously we're going to use different methods, and we're much more aware of what's happening as well.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, it's a stark warning of the power of the world's climate systems. And, with things like changes in Atlantic currents, for instance, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current, or AMOC, how quickly that can shift, and suddenly an area that was previously green is receiving no rainfall. Suddenly, vast areas of aridity can arise. So certainly there's a stark warning there. But our modern society is the most resilient form of human society that has ever existed. It will take a lot more to destroy it than it would to destroy something like the classic Maya civilization. But we're also going to be facing the greatest challenges in the next century that humanity's ever faced. It's going to be a difficult century, and so far we don't seem to be doing very well at meeting those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I'd push back a little bit about saying that our society is more resilient, because we don't know that yet. It's been around for such a short blip in time. If anything, you could easily argue that hunter-gatherer societies are far more resilient because they last for millennia upon millennia, if you see what I mean. And so
that is a very good point. Yeah, I think what I mean is our ability to foresee crises and potentially to respond to them is greater than something like the Sumerians, who were doing their best. You can see them in real time adapting, like your Aegeans, to this new climate system. That as the aridity increases, the salination in the soil increases as they're continually irrigating their fields with river water from the Tigris and Euphrates. And as the salinity of the soil increases, they're unable to grow wheat to the extent that they were previously. We can see unfolding in their meticulously kept records on clay tablets the gradual replacing of wheat as a crop with barley, which is far more salt resistant. So to move on to the second part of the question, you do see these examples of societies adapting and changing in real time. And that up until the moment when an insurmountable challenge is met, every story of a human society is a story of survival and adaptation. A great example is China, which goes through immense periods of upheaval, instability throughout its history. But even though you get kind of imperial dissolution at times, the people are still there. The people keep going, keep recovering. And there's a growing body of collapse studies that tries to view collapse itself as a kind of adaptation, that it's not so much a failure as it is just a unsustainable society rapidly reducing in complexity to a society that is able to sustain itself in the environment.
Yeah, that's one of my warnings is to sort of elites today. If you look at historical collapses of society, what you see is obviously everybody suffers, but what really disappears is the upper crust. It's that hierarchy. And so, the wealthy people today are absolutely dependent upon the society that lifts them up. And so if they're going to continue to do so little, well, then they're going to be the ones that get eaten, without a doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say, we're either going to dismantle fossil fuel industrial capitalism, or it's going to be dismantled. It's going to have what Elon Musk called a rapid, unscheduled disassembly.
Yeah, you wrote about that in your book. I forget if it was the intro or the conclusion, but yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't resist the look at Elon and his exploding rocket.
He deserves it. As the richest person in the world, he should be working his ass off to preserve his position by, helping out with climate change much more than he is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he ruined my favorite website, which is probably the emotional animus for me.
I agree. Like I said, I got the impetus to do those Twitter threads from your threads, and it was just such a shame when that was ruined by that. It's like, and today it's just a wasteland. The amount of trolling on there is just immense. I mean,
yeah. No, I'd like to say it was a big principled decision that made me kind of stride off to blue sky, but really just the blue tick bots at the end of the day ground me down. I couldn't read another ChatGPT bot with a blue tick pushed to the top of replies. Direct messages became completely unusable. Anyway,
no, yeah, but no, I'm with you. It became a really far worse place. That's why I'm mostly on Blue Sky now and YouTube and whatnot. Yeah, it's just this world is so grim sometimes. So do you want to dive in on one of these collapses at all, or what do you want to move on to?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let's go wherever you like.
Yeah, you want to talk about the Aegean Bronze Age, the end of that? What do you think about you jump around? It seems like you mirror a lot of Eric Klein's points in your chapter there. How would you say that you think you differ a bit?
Yeah, I respect Eric Klein's work a lot. I think he's a great writer and a good scholar. So I do certainly follow his work to some extent. Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, the late Bronze Age collapse, and for me it's a little curious why it's become a kind of viral fascination for people online. And this is your field, so you've probably encountered this as well. The people are just really fascinated about this one moment in history when you seem to get a kind of simultaneous collapse of various palace societies around the Mediterranean. But it's unclear to what extent this event was really particularly unique in the context of the Bronze Age. I mean, you're looking at the collapse of various societies that take place across a half-century period, sometimes by some definitions, even a whole century, seemingly in response to, again, a local climate shift that drives the aridity of the region up, puts pressure on agriculture in various regions, but also sends people seemingly from the northern Western Mediterranean raiding and potentially as a kind of seaborne refugees fleeing.
Yeah, these mysterious sea people.
Eastern Mediterranean. Yeah, what we call the sea peoples. It's such a fascinating period because we know so little, because we have these glimpses like the inscriptions on the Medinet Habu mortuary temple of Ramses III that are really sometimes all we get for this period. And they're such untrustworthy texts because they're written by a pharaoh who is, trying to exaggerate the strength of his enemies, the destruction they caused and how brave he was, how heroic he was to have fought them off in the Battle of the Nile Delta, when the Egyptians seemed to ambush the Sea Peoples as they advanced in their ships. But really, it's just a kind of flashbulb of information, and we're completely left guessing. Yeah, there's a lot of, since I published my episode on the Bronze Age collapse, there's been, I think, a little bit of a pushback in the archaeological community on the idea of, how dramatic was this collapse, really? Have some of the destruction layers in certain sites been misattributed or exaggerated? And is there any use in actually describing a Bronze Age collapse at all? Are these just separate phenomena that we're kind of putting under an umbrella for the sake, really, of convenience, and perhaps a little bit for romance and on the part of popular writers?
Yeah,
I think it's an interesting question.
I think a lot of that has to do with, we talked a bit earlier, the definitions of collapse, because if you look at the Bronze Age collapse in the Greek world, it seems to be extremely severe and lasts for many centuries. But, in areas...
Yeah, you get a 4th century Dark Age, don't you, where either no writing's being produced or no writing.
Yeah, we also try to move away from calling it a damn Dark Age anymore, just because,
No, I use Dark Age in the sense of there being no written record, but not in a
and no real monumental architecture anymore or art, but it does look like in some places trade still continues. So Sarah Murray's been excavating in Eastern Attica, and she has these cemeteries that show just, really diverse, rich trade, sort of what would be soon after the collapse. And so, but if you go further east, again, it's so variable. You have like the Phoenicians who sort of come up with their city-states just, several decades, maybe a century after the so-called collapse. And so there's just it's so heterogeneous, if you see what I mean, what happens and the response to it. It's just one of these reasons. That was something I wanted to push on you about, sort of, how do we define a fall of civilization, if you see what I mean, right? It's tough to define.
I mean, it's a question people in collapsology and collapse studies are constantly asking. As you say, the phenomenon of what we kind of conveniently call the late Bronze Age collapse is so varied, so uneven all around the region. Some cities are actually kind of doing fine. They're flourishing during this period. And, sometimes I think about, how long 100 years is. If we look at the collapse of the Soviet Union and the current disintegration of the American empire under Trump, these are happening 50 years apart. We maybe wouldn't necessarily consider them to be part of the same phenomenon. Possibly future historians will. They'll see a kind of connectedness where we might not. But the idea of placing everything from 1925 to 2025 as part of a single phenomenon might seem overly simplistic to the people who live through it, which is us. And similarly with the Bronze Age collapse, you might be looking at a much more complex event that we just simply don't have access to due to the paucity of textual sources. In terms of how we define a collapse, I honestly try not to get too systematic about it. I think many writers try to say, it's this reduction of complexity. It's a writer, Luke Kemp, recently, he has a wonderful book called Goliath's Curse coming out, where he does a really data-driven approach to various collapses. And he divides it into 3 separate categories where you can get, where a society can undergo, I might get this wrong, but a population collapse, an economic collapse, and a political collapse. And he says, you can undergo one of these without, without actually undergoing a collapse. You can undergo a reduction in population without us calling it a social collapse. You can undergo a change in government without it being a social collapse. But if you undergo all 3, then that's how we're going to define it. I think you could take that kind of approach. For me, I always just return to the figure of the ruin. Have cities been abandoned? Have monumental buildings been left to decay? Has a way of life disappeared? And just taking what I can only describe as a story-based approach to it is how I've always approached these questions.
Okay. Yeah.
So for me, I'm never very interested in the pure dissolution of an empire. Things like the collapse of the British Empire, for instance, are dramatic stories. They're absolutely fascinating, but all we really see is the moving from a centralized government to various local governments, independence movements, resistance movements. You don't see a kind of whole-scale abandonment of cities, which is really the kind of story that excites me. My first example that really got me passionate about doing this project is Roman Britain, where you actually do get quite a pure example of the utter collapse of a society. Britain is a very unique colony within the Roman Empire partly because it's an island, it's somewhat separated from the rest of the Roman mainland, but it's also almost entirely economically dependent on the situation of vast legions being stationed in the island. There are sometimes 2 legions in the British Islands. And almost the entire local economies of Romanized cities is based around these soldiers being present. Once they're withdrawn around the year 410 AD, the entire Romanized economy collapses. Overnight, we see the collapse of whole industries like mining, metalworking, even pottery making. And the historian Robin Fleming describes in a wonderful book called The Material Collapse of Roman Britain, the way whole classes of objects suddenly just simply disappear from the archaeological record. And it changes the way British people live. Now that the Romanized economy is no longer producing big pots that were previously used to cook stews, people stop eating stew. People stop burying their dead in coffins because you need iron nails to hammer in the coffin planks. They stop wearing hobnails in their boots. They start foraging more, and they lose access to herbs like coriander and parsley that are being grown in Romanized gardens. So almost overnight, you get the house of cards of an entire Roman colony disappears. And that's not the situation in other parts of the empire. If you live in Gaul, you might have seen a rampaging barbarian band go past your village. You might have seen some social disintegration. You probably pay your taxes to a new guy now. If you live in Egypt or Constantinople, what collapsed?
Yeah,
Nothing
exactly.
collapsed. Life goes on exactly as normal. But in Britain, you just get this almost thunderclap, where within decades, Romanized cities are being abandoned, and eventually London itself becomes completely uninhabited. There's a marvelous artifact called the Billingsgate brooch, which is a Saxon brooch that has been dropped on top of the roof layer, on top of the collapsed roof tiles of one bathhouse on the north bank of the Thames. And it shows that Saxon people were visiting these ruins and wandering around them. They were perhaps gathering herbs, looting the place, perhaps looking for precious bits of metal to find, perhaps just exploring them as tourists, kind of reveling in the romance and melancholy of a ruined place, just like we do today. But it shows that this city was a source of fascination for them to wonder.
See, even though you don't get nuanced on your definitions, you still are extremely nuanced within the book, which is why I really like it. Because, it's sort of like, I think your description of Easter Island is really poignant in that sense, because not only is there this palimpsest nature to ruins, where they have so many different meanings, there's kind of that same approach where you look at the different ways that us today have approached collapse of these different societies in the past as we keep evolving in our approach to them, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I feel very touched by the story of Easter Island, which is a story of great suffering and sadness. It's a story of people who were living a pretty good life on an island where they'd developed a sophisticated way of sustaining their population. They grew crops like sweet potato and taro in stone gardens called manovae, which are quite ingenious sort of lithic structures designed to concentrate moisture and prevent the groundwater from being evaporated by the sun, which allowed them to have quite thriving gardens. They kept chickens, they kept orchards by the accounts of early visitors. But with the arrival of Europeans, as you get across the New World, across the uncontacted world, the introduction of European diseases, or old world diseases, I should say, like measles, like smallpox, which rake through these populations with immense mortality, mortality rates of up to 90%. And on top of this, you also get very predatory behaviors by slave raiders sometimes coming to the island to abduct large numbers of the population. Whalers who, once all the whales are depleted in the Atlantic, start moving into the South Pacific to, continue their industry and stop off at the island, engaging in all kinds of destructive activities there. And the thing is, the population of Easter Island crashed to perhaps only 100 people at one point, from which all the modern, people of Easter Island are ultimately descended. But in modern times, their story has been kind of perverted and turned on its head. They're now blamed for their own destruction.
For early European explorers, there was no greater mystery than what they called the riddle of Easter Island. The French seafarer and artist Pierre Loti wrote about it in the 19th century.
There exists in the midst of the great ocean, in a region where nobody goes, a mysterious and isolated island. The island is planted with monstrous great statues, the work of I don't know what race, today degenerate or vanished, its great remains an enigma.
We've actually encountered this kind of thinking a number of times over the course of this series. When European explorers discovered the ruins of past civilizations, they often found it hard to believe that so-called primitive people had a hand in their construction. Whether it's assuming that the ruins of Angkor were built by the Romans, or that the Mayan ruins of Tikal were built by the citizens of Atlantis, European writers have often struggled to believe that the indigenous people of other lands were capable of great constructions. This kind of thinking follows a circular logic. Only a so-called advanced civilization could have built these things. But the people I see living here don't look like an advanced civilization. Therefore, these people can't have built these monuments. The problems with this kind of thinking are obvious. It deceives us into thinking that an advanced civilization can only look like a European civilization, highly centralized and organized. And the very notion of a society being advanced suggests that human progress follows a fixed and inevitable path, and that our way of organizing our societies and economies is the only one. It's this kind of thinking that made early explorers of Easter Island look at the advanced rock mulching techniques of the Rapa Nui people and see only a wasteland scattered with rocks.
Jared Diamond, the writer of the book Collapse, I think quite well-meaningly tried to use the island as an example of people who foolishly destroyed their environment, who didn't have the foresight to see that they were depleting their soil. And he pushes what has been called the ecocide argument in Easter Island, that the people foolishly overexploited their environment, that they drove their people to famine, and that everyone resorted to cannibalism, even, he says. But really, the archaeological record doesn't show this at all. It doesn't show any signs of warfare or violence on the island any more than any other human society. There's no manufacture of weapons. There's no fortification structures that we see on other Polynesian islands where we know that there was warfare, there was violence. So really get the adding of insult to injury, the destruction of this island by the forces of European colonialism, ultimately capitalism, once the island is leased to a company that uses it as a sheep ranch, stripping the island of its vegetation. But then the blaming of its own people for the situation it ends up in. It's very unfair. And even it must be said, the use of Easter Island in modern conspiracy by conspiracy content creators. Now, they didn't even carve their statues.
The third most common question is, how do they move the statues? And my answer was, after a while, in a joking fashion, I don't care. And they would be like, but how can you say that? This is what we're here for. And I'm like, listen, here's the easy bit. They move them.
Yeah.
All right. Let's make that parallel. Let's just establish that premise.
I think that this obsession it smacks of colonialism itself. I mean, it's sort of like, it's like saying, how can we believe these Stone Age people could move these huge stones? And I mean, that's exactly what draws in pseudo-archaeologists. That's why anytime there's megaliths, really big stones, it's aliens or Atlantis or whatever. Right. And it's sort of like, moving really big stones, cultures all over the world in different periods have figured this out. It's not rocket science. I mean, it's moving really large stones. It's principles of physics and geometry and stuff like that,
Mana moved the Moai.
Okay.
The chief's energy moved the Moai. And it's not through telekinesis. It's not through magic. It's through his ability to organize the economic, ideological, and socio-political components of life. These guys are project managers in today's day and age. And they look to find all of the pieces. They've got to feed their workers. I think one of the hardest things to move the statues is twofold. One, spirituality. There's a spiritual component about making one of your dead ancestors walk back to his home platform.
Mm-hmm.
And then the socio-political connections, because you're passing through another clan's land.
Yeah.
Those are the more difficult questions than the physicality of how do you move statues. Dude, they move them. We don't have a problem to think about anywhere in the classic world, these individuals moving large marble columns and statues. But when it comes to other cultures of the world, especially in the Pacific, there's no way they can do that.
Yeah.
Absolutely they could.
Like Ancient Apocalypse, which
You
were just on QAA Pod talking about that kind of stuff. Yeah. And here, let me play a quick clip. I want to get you laughing.
So anyway, by now I've seen it all. But by far the most tedious and sanctimonious of the lot are the users always clogging up my comments with their endless, insane diatribes. The fans of one man whose name I see day in and day out and have begun to truly hate. Graham Hancock.
Harsh.
The worst thing is the constant whining his community engages in. They're obsessed with their own sense of persecution. Always like, oh, you're not willing to engage on the facts, you just hate Graham. And I want to go on the record right now and say, yeah, I fucking hate this guy. I hate his weepy little eyes. I hate the way he hovers around archaeological sites like an uninvited ghost, looming like a rheumatoid praying mantis over the stones. I hate the way he tricks indigenous historians who often speak English as a second language into appearing on his show, manipulates them during interviews, and then selectively edits what they say. So yes, I am a true hater. If Graham Hancock has one hater on this earth, it is me.
Harsh words, this is the kind of thing people expect me to say.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm interested to hear your take on all this. I just, because...
we should do an episode on your podcast about fake collapse of civilizations. I was thinking about that while prepping this. We could do something on that, or I could do a different one with you on my show and think about that because, look, what you and Annie did for that pod, the research you did, was phenomenal. In fact, you guys went back.
Yeah, she did a
marvelous job. She did, especially going back to signing the seal and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Annie's my wife, so I was talking to her a lot while she was writing that episode, and I think her approach was absolutely perfect. That the whole idea of ancient apocalypse, the idea that there's this ice age civilization that could lift stones with their brains and melt walls and things, is so stupid that it baffles me that anyone finds it even remotely convincing. I think what Annie did was to go back and just take you through the story of Graham Hancock, show you that from the very beginning, he's been a kind of provocateur. He's been someone who has thrived on creating controversy and who kind of falls in love with his own sense of his messianic sense of himself as a person going on a quest that is quite drug fueled. That he, you know, is a really common user of ayahuasca. I've never heard of anyone taking ayahuasca 70 times in their life. That sounds like it would melt your brain. But by Graham's own account, he has, and has, you know, encountered demons and so on while he was on the drug. This stuff is truly mad, and I think what's dangerous about it is that it has the gloss of Netflix, that it has the really well-produced production values, that it presents itself as a factual account of real things that happened. And for a lot of people who don't necessarily have the toolkit to dismantle, you know, where the truth is being bent, where the omissions are leaving out key information, people rely on what something looks like in order to tell whether it can be trusted. And when you give something that Netflix gloss, it becomes quite dangerous. I mean, it starts to really separate people from reality. And it's just, well, I wonder what you think. As your listeners know, you engaged in an amazing debate with Graham Hancock. I saw one person on Twitter describe it as the greatest piece of public engagement for archaeology of the century.
I actually think that was Eric Klein. Speaking of him, yeah.
Oh, right, yeah, yeah. You did such a great job. I wonder how your perspective has changed, or whether it has changed, on the use of engaging with these people. Because since then, you know, you've been the target of harassment, and these outriders he has, people like Jimmy Corsetti, is it?
Here, wait, I got that clip too. Here we go.
Yeah, we just sat and watched like his 3-hour debate on the Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah.
And I thought because I had this impression of him from Ancient Apocalypse as being very kind of mild-mannered, but I actually thought he came across as a bit like bitter. He kind of was a bit sort of like rude, and I don't know. It actually, I was a bit like, oh, they actually gave me quite a polished version of you, I think.
Yeah, he also just has a kind of a bunch of acolytes. There's a guy called Jimmy Corsetti, another guy called Dan the Debunker. And these are guys who kind of orbit around him and create YouTube content. And they're more kind of like his outriders, his like attack dogs. And he kind of like assents to this and often responds to their stuff, like tacitly encouraging them. But it kind of allows him to keep his hands clean. Honestly, the campaign of harassment that Flint Dibble has been through since that debate, you know, it shows that these people are actually getting in the way of the work of real archaeologists.
Well, I guess we'll see if they'll come for us after this episode.
Yeah, Dan the Debunker's got our number.
I mean, so yeah, I mean, I think you're spot on. Especially the point about him keeping his hands clean and letting his fans actually do the dirty work of lying and harassing me. I mean, they've said some nasty things about me. They claim I faked my cancer. They've labeled me as a Jew. They've done like, you know, this connection with anti-Semitism. And so but look, I have zero regrets. I mean, the aftermath of that debate, it still resonates quite clearly. I know this won't come out for at least a week or so, but or maybe a few days, but I just did a live stream yesterday to honor the anniversary of that debate. And, you know, it's sort of like, it's really clear. I see so many people, I've seen thousands of people that say, you know, I used to believe his stuff. I wasn't like some of them were huge fans. Some of them were like, I bought all his books and stuff like that. And others were like, well, I just heard him on Rogan and liked his show. But now that I saw how he doesn't have evidence and you guys do, I'm convinced real archaeology has its shit together. And so I think that it was worthwhile. I mean, you know, I think that I don't regret it in the least. I think, you know, Annie works with QAA Pod, and I think there's, I'd like to, like I said to you before we started recording, I want to have her on to talk more about the connections and the relationship between pseudo-archaeology and other conspiracy theories. But I know this connection intimately from having them troll me and engage with me. I mean, I am constantly mocked with anti-Semitism, and I'm vaccine injured and all this kind of crap. And I think it's important to expose that, is what I see. I think we need to, I mean, we're dealing with this period of climate change. We're dealing with issues like pandemics and whatnot, and we need to build faith in science and education and things like that. And so we have to do what we can. We have to speak up, is my mind. Yeah.
I mean, I think so. I fear that our collective intelligence as a society is just being eroded at a terrifying pace. And by that I don't mean IQ or brain power or anything, but just simply our ability to observe and describe reality is being completely eroded by people like this. I mean, have you come across the channel Uncharted?
Yes, of course. I'm working on a video. It's months away,
Bandicoot.
but I'm working on a video that's going to be about those granite vases, that kind of thing. And so I figured out, I think, the exact way to. I've been working on this slowly because it's on the fringes of what I'm researching, but it's so popular, and yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, people like that, they produce content at such a rate, and they get everywhere, and it's frightening because if someone has just a kind of like interest in history or archaeology, they just want to learn more, they go onto YouTube and they might see good content like your channel, like something like History Hit, something that's or full of civilizations, but they might just be served this Uncharted X stuff that has them measuring vases and counting nubs and just doing this absolutely brain dead nonsense. And again, like, some people aren't capable seemingly of telling the difference between those two kinds of content.
And certainly the algorithm.
Channels always...
And so, that's one reason why I'm trying to host people like you, and I hope we can start developing more tags on YouTube so that we train the algorithm that our content relates with people that present real stuff, so that after one of your shows, they don't get served something like this, right? They get served something real. I think that we want to gain. That's one of my big goals, is to create a stronger ecosystem between those of us creating real content, right?
I think it's important, but there's also this problem that a lie gets around the world twice before the truth has got its shoes on. The example is this supposed superstructure existing beneath the Pyramid of Giza. This absolutely bizarre study released by a group of conspiracy
theorists. I have a couple episodes on that.
Yeah, it was just suddenly released. They didn't even release any results. They just released a press release. There was no peer review. It was an insane use of a technology that, as far as I can tell from archaeologists responding, can't be used for the purpose they're describing. With these absolutely sensational claims about spiral staircases going down 600 meters into the earth. And instead of people's skeptical minds saying, "What are you talking about? The Giza Plateau is a solid piece of limestone. The water table is relatively high. Of course there aren't 600 meters of spiral staircases." Even before going into the problems with the study, cannot our brains just, with common sense, say, obviously that's not the case? But that ability to sift between truth and obvious falsehood just seems to be leaching out of society bit by bit, partly due to the active work of these content creators that produce disinformation, but partly, I don't know, due to our addiction to the internet.
Maybe, but I think
it makes me very
pessimistic. I'm like you guys do a lot of research in this conspiracy culture, so do I, and it's easy to get very pessimistic about the state of our world. But I mean, look, if you look at the YouTube landscape for archaeology, your channel has far more views than any of these channels. Milo Rossi and the Mini Minuteman channel has far more subscribers and views than any of those channels. So I mean, these channels are loud because they have a very committed, devoted, cult-like following. But to be honest, I actually think the majority of people would rather consume one of your podcasts than something by Uncharted X or Jimmy Corsetti, or even Graham Hancock might be the one exception because he's really at the top of them, and with his Netflix show and stuff like that might have had more views. But I think overall, I think that there's a spin to this, that we can have a little bit more optimism, and we have something we can build on. You know,
I would like to think so. I mean, but it kind of goes to the heart of why people want to learn about history, what they want to get from it, and I think something we talked about on QAA is that Graham Hancock, despite being a kind of drug-addled fantasist, is he gives people a sense of romance or a sense of discovery, a sense of connection to people of the ancient past, even though, he's presenting this absolutely bizarre version of the ancient past. And so what I would hope for Fall of Civilizations is that it takes people through these stories with a sense of romance, with a sense of connection to how people lived back then, what it was like to be a person who went through these stories. I don't know if it's a failure of popular history that it isn't doing that, or I don't think it's a failure of archaeology, because it's not archaeology's job. Archaeology's job is to uncover and interpret the ancient past, the remains of the past. It's a historian's job perhaps to interpret what archaeologists provide. A popular historian's job possibly to interpret what a historian is saying. But I don't know. I think you can only diffuse the power of these channels by offering people something different and more powerful.
Yeah, no, I agree. Hey, do you have about 15 more minutes or no? Okay, just want to make sure. I didn't want to keep you away from something. Yeah, and I think that what you do, and you're one of the best in the business at creating that kind of romanticism. And also, I think, just because you're like the flip side in my mind to Graham Hancock, because part of what you do is you create that romantic journey of going to these ruins and you bring them to life, but you also tap into the kind of catastrophism that he taps into. And I'm going to ask you to lend your amazing voice to read the last page of your book, the last 2 pages, I guess, if you don't mind. Let me pull them up on screen.
I actually have.
Oh, if you want to do that, you can do that. Yeah, I'm sure you do.
It's reversed. But this is Fall of Civilizations: Stories of Greatness and Decline, which has just come out in paperback in the UK.
Yeah, everybody should get it.
Yeah, please do buy a copy, because my son is 1 year old at the moment, and it turns out nappies are very expensive.
And with tariffs, they're going to get even more expensive.
Get worse. Yeah. Yeah. So this is the final chapter in which, after looking at all these stories of collapse from Carthage, the Inca, the Aztecs, Roman Britain, the classic Maya, etc., I tried to cast my gaze forward into the future. I'm a historian, I'm not a futurist, so this was for me a bit of a departure. It was an imaginative exercise, and it slightly verges into the realms of science fiction. But here I imagine what life will be like for people who come after our society. Eking out a living among these ruins of a vanished world will be difficult, but in many ways the lives of the people who come after our industrial society may be better than the peoples who came before it. On a warmer planet, tropical diseases like malaria may spread further north, but smallpox has already been eradicated, and other afflictions like leprosy have been cleared from much of the world. If some degree of medical knowledge can be preserved, then future people will understand germ theory and know to boil water, disinfect wounds, and quarantine the sick. Unlike our ancient ancestors, their crops will be descended from our highly cultivated modern variants, and their livestock from high-yield modern breeds. And with the tangerine glow of streetlights gone from the night sky, they will once more see the stars. Most of the easily reachable iron, copper, and tin was mined long ago, and so the people of the coming centuries will likely need to extract these materials from the ruins of the fallen world. Just as the scavengers of post-Roman Britain once picked through their abandoned cities, so people may clamber through the leaning, unstable skyscrapers, along streets now turned into forests, hung with vines and creepers. They will strip their steel rebar, copper piping, and aluminium facades, so that the scrap can be melted down and beaten into knives, hammers, weapons, and other objects. They will gather trinkets of plastic and glass to sell on, artifacts whose original use will be forgotten but are still cherished. In coastal cities, they may paddle between the inundated buildings in canoes, and like the Mayan peasants who once inhabited the abandoned palaces of their kings, perhaps they will wonder at the strange markings painted on the cracked roads they now sail over, still visible on the rusting road signs that rise out of the water, and written in long-dead neon over these cities of ghosts.
Yeah, it's a very poignant picture, if you see what I mean, and it does capture that kind of vision of a dystopian catastrophic event, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I always say to people that I'm pessimistic about the future of industrial society, but I'm optimistic about humans. You know, all the stories we look at in this book and throughout the podcast, they're stories not only of collapse and failure, but stories of resilience, of people continuing after the collapse, people rebuilding, recoalescing into new forms, and new societies emerging, like the green shoots that push through the earth after a forest fire. Humans are immensely resilient, and we're also great at coming together after dissolution and disintegration. You know, throughout some of the worst periods of history, humans have felt much like we have today, that they were living through a period of immense upheaval, of unprecedented destruction, watching, you know, things that they might have taken for granted their whole lives disintegrate before their eyes. But looking at these stories, we can see that that's an ancient feeling. It's not a modern one. And that people through the fall of Rome, people through the collapse of Sumer and Akkad, through the Maya collapse, the burning of Carthage, they kept having children, they kept writing poetry, they kept on living. So, you know, I hope that this isn't a hopeless vision, but actually one that contains a grain of hope in it, that life will go on.
Yeah, and I hope it, if anything, it inspires people to actually do what we need to do to mitigate and adapt to this disaster. Because, I mean, I'd rather not have our descendants picking through the ruins of these cities. I'd rather us come up with a way to actually address this problem. I mean, as scary as it is, we are smart and capable of overcoming this. It's just an open question of whether we will act on those. Yeah.
I like to believe so. You know, my son's 1 year old, and if he lives to be 80, you know, the average lifespan, he'll see the year 2100. We can only imagine what the world will look like on that year. I do worry sometimes about the world that he's inheriting, the world that we're leaving him.
Yeah, but the future is not written. If there's anything that history, my study of history and archaeology shows, it's that really anything can happen. History is written by everybody. And so we're doing that right now. And I mean, obviously things look a little grim right this second. I'm not going to deny that. And certainly your picture is one possible future. But as a historian, I have full faith that there's a wide variety of different possible pictures for our future, if you see what I mean. But I do think that this kind of romantic approach and trying to really tug at people by their heartstrings, that's one way that we can try to inspire people to actually act, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. You know, I like to show people that the past was an amazing place, you know, that you can, without exaggerating or deviating from what we have from the historical material, what we have from data, from written records, you know, keeping things grounded in those facts, that the past was amazing, and that you can find examples of these voices reaching out to you from the ancient past, that show you that these people were human. They lived real lives just like us. They were just as ingenious and creative as we are.
100%.
And that it makes us feel like we're not alone going through this moment, because we know that people in the past have gone through it.
Yeah,
too.
I mean, not to dwell on the fantasists, but that's one of my critiques of these fantasy ideas of the past, because they simply fail to understand that these people were extremely smart, even though they don't have our modern technology. They were capable of carving granite vases and building pyramids and things like that without all the tech that we have. And it's a lack of imagination to appreciate that, you know? Yeah.
No, absolutely.
So, okay, I want to just end with finishing that question from Patreon. Do you ever plan to look at the global crisis of the 17th century?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. You know, sometimes I feel like history for me ends at 1500. I'm not an early modernist, but I would certainly like to. I would certainly like to look at it.
And then I guess my question for you is, what's next? Are you going to continue with your Fall of Civilizations podcast, or do you have another angle that you're turning towards?
I think I have 3 more episodes in me. 3 more that I really want to do before I finish. And then maybe a final episode, just kind of similar to this final chapter in the book, asking what have we learned? What can we take away from all of these stories? And what does our future look like? I think that would be necessary to cap off the series. And I'm also working on a third novel, which I'm quite excited about. Yeah, I'm not going to give too much away about it, but it is going to be an attempt to tell a story in the post-apocalyptic genre, but set in our past.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a challenge, but quite a fruitful one. I'm enjoying it.
Very cool. All right. Well, we have a lot to look forward with you. Thank you so much for joining me. And yeah, it was actually, we've communicated a bunch, but we've never actually come face to face in this way. So very, very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on Flint. A wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
Rhymes and riddles, tickle, tickle, giggles, squiggle, jiggle, fiddle, Flint, Dibble. Rhymes and riddles.